Hey everybody, welcome back to our Effects on Violin series. This is week 10. We were talking about distortion. Hope you dig the shades. Got two reasons for these. One, it's Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day to you. And two, because I love distortion. So let's get started. In this series, we are hitting a different effect each week. We'll talk about what it is, how to use it, where to get that effect, where to put it in your effects chain. And then most weeks, we have a guest artist who's going to be talking about how they use this effect in their work. This is a list of the first few weeks and the artists that we brought in. And here are the most recent few weeks. If you've missed any of these, they're archived on our YouTube channel. You can check those out. You definitely should. They're really good, if I do say so myself. This week, we were talking to my buddy Earl Maneein. There's a link to that interview here. It's going to be a separate video from this chat where we're talking about sort of the more nuts and bolts of how to use distortion. This chat with Earl is talking about more his journey into using distortion with electric violins and how to do that, some of the tips and tricks that he's found. Really cool video. Earl is always a hoot to hang out with, and I figured I'd give you a little taste of what our discussion was like.
It's two of the guys from Killswitch Engage that were in that band. It's Howard Jones and Justin. What are those balloons? Holy
I have
smoke.
no idea. I was hoping you knew. I was like, apparently somebody's having a birthday.
What are those balloons?
There's nothing more metal than a balloon, man.
I was like, I have not done drugs since
Today.
Like my 20s, really? That I don't know, it's like some acid flashback.
I should have just acted like I didn't see him.
Yeah. That's what you should have done. You should have been like, what are you talking about?
What balloons, Earl?
I don't know. That's you. Listen, you all right? You all right?
Earl is always fun to hang out with, incredibly knowledgeable about these things, and I think you're going to dig that chat a lot. But first, we're going to talk about what distortion is and how to use it, and then you will really enjoy that discussion. So we all know what distortion sounds like, right? Rock and roll! But what is it? If we know scientifically what it is, it's going to allow us to make better decisions. We can make better decisions about how to use it. It is the intentional clipping of a signal through a circuit that is going to produce some sort of overtones, undertones, some additional harmonic content, which is going to change fundamentally the sound that we're making. If you remember back in our gain staging video, we talked about looking at a signal. We'll use a sine wave to represent our signal. And the top and bottom here, imagine those are sort of the edges of the circuit. Imagine we've got like a 4-foot diameter pipe. And this first signal, maybe that's a 2-foot tall signal that we're putting through this pipe. It's going to go through. It's not going to touch any of the edges. And it's going to pass through just in the same shape that it started out. We're going to amplify that signal a little bit more. Now it's maybe 3.5 feet. It's still going to pass through that 4-foot pipe without touching any of the edges. And it's going to come out the same way it went in. But what if we boost it even more? If we try to go to a 5-foot tall signal through a 4-foot pipe, it's going to bump and it's going to scuff along the inside of that pipe, and it's going to create what we call clipping, and it's going to change the shape of that wave. That adds high frequency content, and that's really important. We're going to be talking about that a lot. This is a little clip from a video about saturation where they're talking about where does that high frequency content come from. He goes into way more math than this in the video, which I highly recommend. But here's just a quick clip about where do those high frequencies come from.
If I clip the peak, I'm changing the shape of the wave. But one way to look at it is that instead of me clipping the wave, I'm adding on a new wave that looks like this. This is because this new wave is doing the same thing as the sine, just flipped upside down. So when we take our sine wave and add this new wave, the peaks of the sine are canceled, giving us the clipped wave. These two ideas are equivalent, so changing the shape of the wave in any way must change the frequency content. The added frequencies from clipping are just the frequencies of this new wave.
So if we think about the way that it's clipping, we've got a sine wave that looks like somebody took a razor blade and went across on there. That's not how actual circuits work. Actual circuits are like real things. And think about something going through a pipe. It's not going to shear it off completely. It's going to get kind of jagged and rough. Each circuit does that differently. The harmonic content that's added is different, and it's going to have a different sound. So here's a quick demo where you can hear a couple of different distortion circuits and how they affect the signal of the violin. Now, the first thing you might think is that, oh, some of those are louder than other ones. No, they're not. They all meter out pretty much the same, which tells us that there's a difference between actual loudness and perceived loudness. And the way the human ear hears things, high frequencies are interpreted as loudness, as volume. And because those all metered out the same, they had the same amount of energy in each circuit, the way that energy is distributed between high frequencies and low frequencies affects how you perceive the loudness of that signal. So you may have to make each EQ or level adjustments to your signal so that your audience is going to think that they're hearing the same volume between one type of signal and another. Remember, your audience doesn't have meters, they just have ears. So, a couple things to get straight on terminology. Gain or drive is how much the circuit is clipping. It's how much we're amplifying that signal before we feed it into the circuit. Or imagine how much are we amplifying that before we feed it into this 4-foot pipe, right? So that's before. Level is how loud it is after. We will have two volume controls. One, how much we boost that signal before we feed it to the circuit, and then how much we boost or cut that signal after it comes out of the circuit. So that's level. So if you're seeing on your amplifier, there might be gain and volume. Gain is before the tubes, volume is after the tubes. Or if you've got a distortion pedal, you might see boost or level or boost or gain, and then level is after. So before and after, that's going to help us. The other thing that we will generally have are some tone controls. Remember, we're adding high frequency content to this. Violins already have a lot of high frequency content. All of these pedals are designed for guitars, which don't have as much. If we've got a bright instrument and we're adding more highs to it, we may need to dial back the tone so it doesn't sound like we're breaking glass here, okay? Now, there are some common characteristics, even though each circuit is different, there are some common characteristics to any distorted signal. There are way more overtones and undertones. The tonality of our sound is getting much more complex. We were going to have compression and we were going to have sustain, okay? So with overtones and undertones, because we're making our signal more complex, there are more interactions between all these frequencies. It's going to amplify some intonation issues. Now, if you play a third on your violin, a major third, and you're a little bit out of tune, you can hear that. It kind of bugs you, right? But if you run that through a distortion signal, it is going to get way more obvious that you're playing out of tune. In fact, my friend Chuck Bontrager does a whole class on how to use distortion to help you learn how to play more in tune. So distortion it's going to hide some sort of right hand issues, but it is going to amplify any left hand issues you have. The other cool thing about it is that you can now hear Tartini tones or difference tones a lot more. So if you play a double stop in tune or out of tune, there's generally another note underneath that's kind of in there. In an undistorted environment, you can hear that, but you really have to listen for it. Once we start distorting things, those Tartini tones get pretty loud, and you're going to hear, in a demo I'm going to do, you're going to hear one that's really, really coming out at you. And then there's a big difference between single notes and double stops. So if I'm playing one line by itself and then I drag another string with it, it is going to sound very, very different. And the amount of harmonic complexity is a lot more once you start using distortion. Also, compression shrinks dynamic range. So if you're playing really, really loud and then really, really soft, the difference between those might be here going in, but it might be this coming out because we're shrinking the dynamic range. If dynamics are a very important part of your performance, you're going to have to take that account, knowing that distortion is going to shrink that dynamic range. And then the other thing it does is it creates sustain. Any note that you bump and just kind of leave to ring, the instrument is going to ring out a lot more with distortion than it does without. So you're going to have to account for that in your playing as well. And here's a quick demo to kind of show us through each of the things we just talked about. All right, so you've convinced me, Matt. I want distortion. How do I do this? There are three kind of basic methods that we use to get distortion. One is a distortion pedal. You've probably seen those. Another one is a tube amp, like a regular electric guitar amp. And then the third is kind of a digital simulation of that called an amp simulator. Distortion pedals, again, each one is going to sound different. And you're going to have to experiment with your instrument and your playing style and the rest of your rig, because the rest of your rig does affect how these things sound. You're probably going to have to do a lot of auditioning of different distortion pedals to get the sound that you want. I'm sorry, there's not any real shortcuts. You're just going to have to try these things. Now, the pros of a distortion pedal is that they're small. They can fit on your pedal board. They're often inexpensive. Some of my favorite ones are $50 or so. And they're easy to turn on and off. They're easy to kind of turn the knobs on and really dial in for a sound that you like. The cons, well, they're designed to go ahead of a guitar amp. Generally, a distortion pedal is going to be something that's in front of a tube amp. So they can get a little bit tinny and brittle without a tube amp coming after them. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But just so you can hear the difference between a couple different distortion pedals, here's a quick demo. And to reiterate, those all metered out at the same level. So you've got to kind of be aware of actual versus perceived loudness, okay? Tube amps, that's kind of the second way to get distorted sound. Again, each one sounds different. It is a great way to get a specific sound. They allow you to hear yourself. That's the cool thing about a tube amp. You're going to have it on stage with you, and you're going to be able to hear yourself playing. The pros, they sound great. They're easy to work with. There's usually only a handful of knobs on each one. And you, as the player, are going to have control over what the other people on stage hear, what the people in the audience hears. You have a lot of control over that, right? Because you've got a lot of power sitting behind you. The cons, impedance issues. Electric violins have a very high impedance. Electric guitar amps are typically expecting a lower impedance. You may have to put a preamp or something in front of that amp before it works right for you. Volume issues. The louder a guitar amp is, the the better they tend to sound. So that's why guitar players just tend to be insanely loud on stage. They're like, oh yeah, it just doesn't sound good when it's low. Well, they're right. They do sound better when they're turned up. So if you could find yourself in kind of some loudness wars, you might have sound guys yelling at you. That's one of the issues with using a tube amp. Versatility. If you want to have a bunch of different sounds in your performance, I want to have a very nice clean sound. I want to have a heavy sound. I want to have kind of a bright sound. Typically, these amps are going to kind of sound one or two different ways. And if you want a lot of versatility, a tube amp may not be the right answer for you. Maintenance issues. Tube amps are incredibly high maintenance. You're going to be buying tubes. If these things are bouncing down the road in the back of a semi-truck, they require a lot of maintenance. And they can be very, very expensive. Tube amps can start at a few $100 and go up to many, many, many thousands of dollars. So kind of the third way is an amp simulator. Full disclosure, this is the way that I've chosen to go in my career. Amp simulators generally they sort of look like multi-effects pedals. They do have a bunch of effects in them, yes, but the biggest part for this discussion is they have a bunch of digital simulations of real tube amps. Because they don't have speakers in them, it's just an effects pedal basically. It allows you to have 0 stage volume. You can go in-ears. There's no sound coming out at all, which is going to make your sound person very happy. But it also means that you are completely at the mercy of that sound person. So they can be very versatile. They work great with violins. We don't have the impedance issues with those. They can be silent. They don't have any physical tubes in them to be breaking and going bad. The cons, the really good ones, are pretty expensive. Helix, Fractal, Kemper, the Quad Cortex, we're thousands of dollars for these things. And you do need to be a little bit tech savvy to make them work. It's not quite as simple as just going up to an amp, turn it on, put everything on 10. And then because they are multi-effects pedals, they're not as easy to tweak live. You can go back to your amp and just turn something up or down. It's these amp simulators, it's not always quite as easy to do that. So some common mistakes that people make. The biggest one is using too much distortion. And Earl and I are going to talk about that a lot. You're like, yeah, I want to sound metal, so I'm going to put everything on 12. That's probably not the right way to do this. I would say not using a cab or a cab sim is a very common mistake, and not adjusting your playing to what is happening when we start running distortion. With the too much distortion, yes, you've heard this before, less is more. It is, and I hate that, but it is. Distortion can make a giant ball of messy sound. Remember, we're adding sonic complexity to our signal. So if we get too much of that distortion, we've just got this, and you can't hear anything. So a good rule of thumb that I've discovered is I'm going to sort of dial all that stuff in until I've got the tone that I think I want. And then if I've got my gain at 5, I'm going to cut it back about 50%. So I'm going to come back to about 2.5. And you're going to go, wow, that's not nearly as much gain. It's going to sound better. Trust me on that. And Earl and I will talk about that in our discussion. You can hear that even at 2, we've got quite a bit of attitude on that sound. When you get up to 8 on that, it can start getting like they're starting to get this big ball of low mid stuff in there that if you're thinking about playing in a group, that could kind of be in the way of some of the other people in the group. Another common mistake is not using an amp or a cab. Remember, pedals are designed to be fed to tube amps. You can end up with a very buzzy or shrill sound. It can be annoying or painful. So let's make sure that if we're going to run a distortion pedal, try to get into a cab or a cab simulator, and it's going to make a huge difference on how good these things sound. So each one of those, when you put a cab after it, it really kind of tames that sound and makes it less like, well, like Earl calls angry bees. So the next big mistake is not adjusting your playing. Because distortion causes a lot of sustain, you're going to need to learn how to kind of choke out the notes with your left hand so that you don't have the notes you played 30 seconds ago is still ringing through and causing problems. The other thing is that these aren't magic. A lot of times you'll hear people and they'll take a distortion pedal and they'll put it on and they go, oh, look, now we're rocking out. And it's awkward and it sounds bad. And you're going to have to change the way you play, just like you did when you weren't distorted. When you were learning how to play an acoustic violin, you had to make adjustments to your technique to get the tone that you want out of the instrument. These pedals aren't magic. They don't make you sound metal. They just add distortion to your sound. And distortion isn't necessarily metal. It could be just bad and awkward. You're going to have to put the attitude into your own performance, and then the tone that you've got is going to make more sense. So I hope that's helpful for you. I love distortion. I know this is a long video, but there's so much to cover here. And man, we could have gone into a lot more. But that's what we had time for today. So as always, be sure to subscribe to our channel, mash that subscribe button, and check out these other videos, including my chat with Earl Maneein. What a boss.